Case File 01. Niels Hogel, the Angel of Death in Scrubs. Imagine walking into a hospital intensive care unit, trusting that the nurse attending to your loved one is there to heal, to comfort, to save lives. Now imagine discovering that this same person, this guardian of health, has been systematically murdering patients for years, turning the sanctuary of healing into his personal theater of death. What if I told you that Germany's most prolific serial killer wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys, but a respected healthcare professional who earned the nickname Lifesaver Rambo from his colleagues? What if the very person patients and families trusted most was orchestrating their deaths with clinical precision? Meet Niels Hogel, a man whose name has become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of the Hippocratic Oath. Between 2000 and 2005, this seemingly ordinary nurse transformed hospital intensive care units into killing fields, murdering at least 85 patients while potentially claiming up to 300 lives. His story isn't just about a serial killer. It's about how evil can hide behind the most trusted facades in our society. Born in 1976, Hogel appeared to be the product of a normal, protected childhood. His father and grandmother were both nurses, role models who inspired his career choice. But beneath this unremarkable exterior lurked a psychological cocktail of narcissistic, dissocial, and compulsive traits that would prove lethal when combined with unlimited access to vulnerable patients. The horror of Hogel's crimes lies not just in their scale, but in their method. This wasn't a killer driven by rage or sexual sadism. No, his motive was far more chilling in its calculated nature. He didn't set out to murder, he set out to play God. Hogel would deliberately inject patients with overdoses of powerful cardiovascular drugs, Ajmaline, Sotalol, lidocaine, triggering sudden cardiac arrests that he would then attempt to reverse in dramatic resuscitation efforts. Picture the scene: alarms blaring, medical staff rushing, a patient's life hanging in the balance while Hogel performs chest compressions, administering medication, fighting to bring someone back from the brink of death. The irony is suffocating. He was fighting to save lives that he himself had endangered. When he succeeded, he basked in the praise and admiration of colleagues who saw him as a hero. When he failed, another victim was added to his growing tally. His hunting grounds were the ICUs of two hospitals in northern Germany: Oldenburg from 1999 to 2002, and Delmenhorst from 2003 to 2005. The victims ranged from 34 to 96 years old, many of them on the path to recovery when Hogel selected them for his deadly theater. These weren't mercy killings of the terminally ill. They were random acts of medical terrorism committed for the sake of his ego. The most disturbing aspect of this case isn't just Hogel's crimes, but the institutional failure that enabled them. At Delmenhorst Hospital, the ICU death rate doubled during his tenure. An astounding 73% of all deaths coincided with his work schedule, a statistical anomaly so glaring it should have triggered immediate investigation. Yet hospital administrators turned a blind eye to these red flags, prioritizing reputation over patient safety. Even when a colleague caught Hogel red-handed on June 22, 2005, manipulating a patient's syringe to deliver a lethal dose of Ajmaline, the hospital's response was unconscionably slow. They waited 2 days before contacting police, 2 days during which Hogel claimed his final victim. This pattern of negligence wasn't isolated to one institution. When he left Oldenburg, they provided him with a clean reference, effectively enabling him to continue his killing spree at his new workplace. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in German criminal history. Police had to exhume more than 130 bodies from cemeteries across Germany, Poland, and Turkey for toxicological testing. The sheer scale of the potential crime scene was staggering, turning routine medical deaths into potential murder cases that had to be painstakingly investigated years after the fact. Högel's path through the justice system was as complex as his crimes. Initially sentenced to 5 years for attempted manslaughter in 2006, mounting evidence and media attention triggered new trials. In 2015, he received his first life sentence for 2 murders. But as investigators continued uncovering victims, a third trial commenced on 100 counts of murder. On June 6, 2019, he was convicted of 85 murders and handed a second life sentence with a judicial finding of severe gravity of guilt, essentially ensuring he will never see freedom again. Judge Sebastian Biermann captured the incomprehensible nature of Högel's crimes. The human mind capitulates in the face of the sheer number of deeds. This wasn't hyperbole. It was an acknowledgement that some acts of evil transcend our ability to fully comprehend them. As of 2025, Högel remains imprisoned, serving multiple life sentences for what stands as post-war Germany's most prolific serial killing spree. His case has fundamentally changed how hospitals monitor staff and patient outcomes, introducing safeguards designed to prevent another angel of death from exploiting the trust placed in healthcare providers. Yet questions remain. How many other Niels Högels are out there, hiding behind scrubs and stethoscopes, waiting for the right moment to play their deadly games? Case File 02, Jürgen Bartsch, the Carnival Killer's Twisted Origin. What transforms an innocent child into a monster? What combination of abuse, trauma, and societal failure creates a predator who targets the most vulnerable among us? The case of Jürgen Bartsch forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and whether evil is born or made. In the industrial town of Langenburg, West Germany, during the turbulent 1,960 seconds, a young man's name became synonymous with unthinkable horror. Jürgen Bartsch, originally born Karl-Heinz Sadrozynski, would become known as the Carnival Killer, a moniker that barely hints at the depths of his depravity. Between 1,962 and 1,966, this teenager systematically hunted, tortured, and murdered 4 young boys, turning an abandoned air raid shelter into his personal chamber of horrors. But Bartsch's story doesn't begin with his first victim. It begins with a childhood so traumatic, so systematically abusive, that it reads like a textbook case study in how monsters are made. His birth mother died of tuberculosis when he was just 5 months old, leaving him to be adopted at 11 months by a butcher and his wife. What should have been a rescue became the foundation of his psychological destruction. His adoptive mother suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder focused on cleanliness. She forbade young Bartsch from playing with other children, convinced they would contaminate him. But her protection was itself a form of violation. She personally bathed him until he was 19 years old, turning what should have been innocent hygiene into sexual abuse that warped his developing psyche. His adoptive father, the butcher, provided a different kind of horror. Regular beatings were administered in the same room where animal carcasses were dismembered, creating a nightmarish fusion of violence and death in the boy's mind. The smell of blood, the sight of severed limbs, and the experience of physical pain became inextricably linked in his psychological development. As if this foundation of abuse wasn't enough, Barch was sexually assaulted by a cousin at age 8 and by a teacher at 13. Each violation added another layer to his psychological damage, creating a distorted framework where sexuality, violence, and death became confused and intertwined. By age 15, these traumatic experiences had crystallized into deadly fantasies that Barch began to act upon. His hunting ground was an abandoned air raid shelter near his home, a relic of World War II that he transformed into a subterranean torture chamber. The symbolism is chilling. A structure built to protect children from the horrors of war became the site where children were subjected to unimaginable horrors. His victims were Klaus Jung, age 8, Peter Fuchs, 13, Ulrich Kahlweis, 12, and Manfred Grassmann, 12. Each boy was lured to the shelter with promises or tricks, then forced into a nightmare from which they would never emerge. In that concrete tomb, Barch would force them to undress, sexually abuse them, torture them with methods learned from his adoptive father's butcher shop, and ultimately kill them before dismembering their small bodies. The ritual nature of these crimes reveals the depth of Barch's psychological damage. This wasn't opportunistic violence, it was the methodical acting out of fantasies that had been brewing in his damaged mind for years. The abandoned shelter became his stage, where childhood trauma was transformed into adult horror. His killing spree might have continued indefinitely, if not for the courage of his intended fifth victim, one 5-year-old Peter Fraze. On that fateful day in June 1966, something went differently in the underground chamber. Barch had left a candle burning, perhaps a part of his ritual, perhaps simple carelessness. Fraze managed to use that flame to burn through his bindings and escape, racing to alert police and finally bringing an end to Barch's reign of terror. When arrested, Barch didn't deny his crimes. He confessed readily, perhaps finding relief in finally sharing the burden of his actions. But his confession opened a Pandora's box that would divide German society and challenge the very foundations of their justice system. The legal proceedings that followed became a national battleground for competing philosophies of justice. The 1,967 trial initially sentenced Barch to life imprisonment, treating him as a fully culpable adult despite his youth when the crimes began. But this verdict was overturned by the federal court in 1969, which ruled that crucial expert testimony about his psychological condition had been ignored. The second trial in 1971 produced a dramatically different outcome. Acknowledging the profound impact of his abusive childhood, the court sentenced him to 10 years in juvenile detention, followed by indefinite psychiatric commitment. This decision sparked a firestorm of public reaction that revealed deep fractures in German society. More than 250 letters poured into the court from ordinary citizens, and their contents paint a disturbing picture of a nation still grappling with its recent past. Many demanded the death penalty, suggesting public hangings or other brutal executions. Disturbingly, some explicitly invoked Nazi ideology, lamenting that this would not have happened under Adolf Hitler, and proposing concentration camps as solutions. Yet equally powerful voices argued for understanding and treatment rather than vengeance. These letters reflected emerging scientific understanding of psychology and trauma, advocating for a more humane approach to justice that recognized the role of abuse in creating monsters. Bartsch himself became caught between these competing philosophies. Desperate to avoid lifetime psychiatric commitment and believing he could be cured, he made the ultimate gamble: voluntary castration. On the 28th of April 1976, at Eichelborn State Hospital, Bartsch underwent the procedure intended to eliminate his sexual deviancy. It was meant to be his path to freedom, but instead became his death sentence when an accidental overdose of the anesthetic halothane stopped his heart forever. He was just 29 years old. The Bartsch case forced post-war Germany to confront fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. Was he a monster who deserved death, or a victim whose crimes were the inevitable result of systematic abuse? Could someone so damaged be redeemed, or was he beyond salvation? These questions remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with the origins of evil and the purpose of our justice system. Bartsch's story serves as a dark reminder that monsters are often made, not born, and that the failure to protect children from abuse can have consequences that echo through generations. His name may be forgotten by many, but the lessons of his case continue to influence how we understand the complex relationship between trauma, psychology, and criminal behavior in our modern world. Case File 03. Frank Gust, the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper's Dark Obsession. What if the man living next door harbored fantasies so twisted, so fundamentally disturbing, that they would drive him to commit acts that defy human comprehension? What if his greatest sexual thrill came not from the living, but from the freshly dead? In the industrial heartland of Germany's Rhine-Ruhr region, a monster walked among ordinary citizens, hiding his grotesque appetites behind a facade of normalcy. Frank Gust, born in 1969, would earn the chilling moniker the Rhine-Ruhr Ripper through a 4-year killing spree that combined murder with necrophilia in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. But Gust's journey into darkness began long before his first human victim. As a child, he displayed the classic warning signs that criminologists now recognize as the homicidal triad, a deadly combination of behaviors that often predicts future violence. He tortured animals, not out of curiosity or accident, but for sexual gratification. The screams of dying creatures became his earliest form of arousal, their deaths providing a rush that would only grow more intense over time. By age 13, even animal victims weren't enough to satisfy his twisted cravings. Gust began breaking into morgues, drawn by an overwhelming compulsion to touch and manipulate human corpses. Picture this disturbed teenager, sneaking through darkened funeral homes and hospital morgues, his hands exploring cold, lifeless flesh, while his mind raced with fantasies of death and decay. These weren't random acts of teenage rebellion, they were the methodical actions of a developing sexual predator whose desires centered entirely on death. The necrophiliac phase of Gust's development reveals the calculating nature of his pathology. He wasn't content with quick, furtive encounters. Instead, he studied morgue schedules, learned security patterns, and planned his intrusions with the precision of a professional thief. But instead of stealing valuables, he was stealing intimacy with the dead, each encounter feeding a hunger that grew more insatiable with time. Yet even unlimited access to corpses couldn't satisfy his ultimate fantasy. In a confession that chilled investigators to the bone, Gust revealed his deepest desire: to touch the beating heart of a dying woman. This wasn't about sex with corpses, it was about experiencing the exact moment when life became death, feeling a human heart's final beats beneath his fingers. To achieve this monstrous goal, he would need to create fresh victims. In 1994, Gust claimed his first human life, a 8-year-old South African woman who made the fatal mistake of accepting his offer of a ride. What should have been a simple hitchhiking journey became a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Gust drove her to a secluded forest near Ede, Netherlands, where he enacted his darkest fantasies. The woman's screams echoed through the trees as Gust subjected her to prolonged torture, savoring every moment of her terror before finally ending her life. But killing her was only the beginning. With the woman's body still warm, Gust began his post-mortem ritual. Using tools he had carefully prepared, he methodically dismembered the corpse, his hands exploring organs that had been beating with life just moments before. The decapitation wasn't random violence, it was a trophy-taking behavior, a way to possess the most intimate part of his victim forever. The horrifying detail that emerged later would shock even hardened detectives. Gust confessed this first murder to both his mother and a close friend. Picture the scene: a son calmly describing how he had tortured and killed an innocent woman, while his mother listened in stunned silence. Yet neither person contacted the authorities. Their silence would cost 3 more women their lives. Between 1996 and 1998, Gust refined his hunting techniques. He prowled the area around Essen's Central Station, a location where vulnerable women, particularly prostitutes, could be found. These women, already marginalized by society, became perfect victims for a predator who understood that their disappearances might not trigger intensive investigations. His method remained consistent: lure the victim to an isolated location, then subject them to prolonged torture that combined sexual assault with systematic mutilation. Gust's surgical precision in dismembering his victims suggested he had studied anatomy, learning exactly how to disassemble a human body while maximizing his own twisted pleasure. He would spend hours with each corpse, fulfilling necrophiliac fantasies that had been building since his teenage years. The final victim was perhaps the most shocking: his wife's 7-year-old aunt, a woman who trusted him as family. This wasn't a stranger picked up on the street. This was someone who knew him, cared about him, and never suspected the monster living within their family circle. Her body was never found, suggesting Gust may have disposed of her remains in a location too personal, too meaningful for him to risk discovery. What makes Gust's case particularly disturbing is how his escalation followed a predictable pattern that could have been interrupted at multiple points. The childhood animal cruelty, the teenage morgue break-ins, the 1994 confession, each represented an opportunity for intervention that was missed or ignored. Instead, his mother and friend became unwitting accessories to murder through their silence, their failure to act directly, enabling 3 additional deaths. Frank Gust represents the nightmare scenario of a sexual sadist whose fantasies could only be fulfilled through murder. His case serves as a chilling reminder that some predators don't hunt strangers in dark alleys, they live among us, hiding their monstrous appetites behind masks of normalcy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Case File 04. Stefan Letter, the heavyweight angel of death. Imagine trusting your life to someone whose very presence brings death. Imagine lying helpless in a hospital bed while the person meant to heal you prepares a cocktail of drugs that will stop your heart forever. This is the terrifying reality of healthcare serial killers, predators who turn places of healing into hunting grounds. In the scenic Bavarian Alps, where tourists come to breathe clean mountain air and restore their health, one hospital became a charnel house disguised as a place of healing. Between January 2003 and July 2004, Stefan Letter, a 145-kilogram nurse with an insatiable appetite for death, transformed a medical facility in Sonthofen into his personal killing field, claiming at least 29 lives in an 18-month reign of terror. Letter's physical presence was as imposing as his psychological pathology. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 23 stone, he cut an intimidating figure as he moved through hospital corridors with deadly purpose. Patients who should have felt comforted by his medical training instead became unwitting. Participants in his grotesque experiments with human mortality. But Letter wasn't content with random killings. He was methodical, calculating, and devastatingly efficient. His weapon of choice wasn't a knife or gun. It was his intimate knowledge of pharmaceuticals and their lethal potential. Working the night shift, when supervision was minimal and witnesses were few, Letter would prowl the wards like a predator selecting his next victim. His killing cocktail was a masterpiece of medical knowledge turned malevolent. Letter would steal muscle relaxant Listhenon and the anesthetic etomidate from hospital supplies, carefully measuring doses that would prove fatal while appearing natural to any cursory examination. The Listhenon would paralyze his victims, leaving them conscious but unable to move or cry for help as their bodies betrayed them. The etomidate would then suppress their respiratory system, creating the perfect storm for cardiac arrest. Picture the horror of these final moments. Patients lying in their beds, perhaps half asleep or watching late-night television, when Letter would appear at their bedside with a syringe full of death. The injection would be swift, professional, administered with the same clinical precision he used for legitimate medical procedures. Within minutes, the Listhenon would begin its work, leaving victims trapped in their own bodies, fully aware but completely helpless as their muscles ceased to obey their commands. As the paralysis took hold, victims would experience the ultimate nightmare, being buried alive in their own flesh. Their minds would remain sharp, desperate, screaming internally while their bodies became prisons they couldn't escape. They would watch Letter's face hovering above them, perhaps recognizing something cold and alien in his eyes, as the etomidate began shutting down their respiratory system. The final moments would be a suffocating descent into darkness, hearts racing with terror while lungs struggled for air that wouldn't come, blood oxygen levels dropping as brain cells began dying one by one. Some victims might have tried desperately to signal for help, their eyes wide with panic, but their paralyzed vocal cords could produce no sound. Their frozen limbs could make no movement. Letter's victim selection revealed the calculating nature of his pathology. He didn't just kill randomly. He chose patients based on opportunity, vulnerability, and his own twisted sense of timing. Elderly patients were frequent targets, their deaths easily attributed to natural causes. But Letter's appetite wasn't limited by age or condition. He attempted to murder a 22-year-old soldier recovering from minor injuries, proving that his motive wasn't mercy, but something far more sinister. The scope of his killing spree is staggering when considered in its full context. 29 confirmed murders over 18 months means Letter was killing someone approximately every 3 weeks. This wasn't sporadic violence driven by emotion or circumstance. It was industrial-scale murder conducted with the efficiency of a production line. What makes Letter's crimes even more chilling is how he would return to work the following day, interacting normally with colleagues and families, perhaps even comforting relatives of his victims while knowing he was responsible for their loved ones' deaths. He would write medical notes, attend staff meetings, and participate in hospital routines, all while carrying the fresh memory of watching another human being die by his hand. The hospital's elderly population made it the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Letter. Families trusted that their loved ones were receiving the best possible care, never suspecting that their relative's friendly night nurse was systematically murdering patients throughout the facility. The mountain setting, with its reputation for clean air and healing, provided the perfect cover for Letter's deadly activities. Letter's method of drug theft shows the premeditated nature of his crimes. He didn't kill impulsively. He planned each murder, carefully selecting and stockpiling the necessary pharmaceuticals. Hospital inventory systems failed to detect the missing medications, another institutional failure that enabled his killing spree to continue unchecked. The true horror of Stephen Letter's crimes lies not just in their number, but in their betrayal of fundamental human trust. Patients in his care should have been safest when most vulnerable, protected by medical ethics and professional standards. Instead, they became unwitting victims of a predator who used his medical knowledge to perfect the art of murder, turning healing hands into instruments of death in the very place where people came seeking life. Case File 05. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper's reign of terror. Imagine walking down a street in northern England during the late 1970s, knowing that somewhere in the shadows, a man with a ball-peen hammer and a sharpened screwdriver is hunting women. Imagine the terror that gripped an entire region as bodies piled up and police chased ghosts while the real monster slipped through their fingers again and again. For 5 blood-soaked years, Peter Sutcliffe transformed the industrial landscape of Yorkshire into a hunting ground where no woman was safe after dark. Between 1975 and 1980, this unassuming truck driver became the Yorkshire Ripper, a name that still sends chills down the spines of those who lived through his reign of terror. Armed with simple tools turned deadly, a ball-peen hammer and a sharpened screwdriver, he butchered 13 women and left 7 others scarred forever. Sutcliffe didn't look like a monster. Standing average height with dark hair and a beard, he could have been anyone's neighbor, colleague, or friend. But behind his unremarkable exterior lurked a predator driven by what he claimed was a divine mission from God. According to his twisted narrative, while working as a gravedigger, he heard the voice of the Almighty commanding him to cleanse the streets of prostitutes, a convenient excuse for acts of savage brutality that defied human comprehension. His killing method was as brutal as it was efficient. Sutcliffe would approach his victims from behind, the hammer concealed until the final moment. The first blow would come without warning, a crushing impact to the skull that would drop even the strongest woman instantly. The sickening crack of metal against bone became his signature, a sound that echoed through empty streets as another life was snuffed out in seconds. But the hammer was just the beginning. Once his victims lay helpless and bleeding, Sutcliffe would produce his second weapon, a screwdriver he had carefully sharpened to a razor point. What followed was an orgy of violence that transformed murder into butchery. He would stab repeatedly, targeting the chest, abdomen, and back with methodical precision. The screwdriver would pierce flesh and organs, creating wounds that spurted blood across cobblestones and alleyways. His first confirmed victim, Wilma McCann, provided the template for what was to come. In October 1975, this mother of four was walking alone when Sutcliffe struck. The hammer blow sent her crashing to the ground, her skull fractured and bleeding. As she lay semi-conscious, Sutcliffe pulled out his screwdriver and began his ritual of destruction, stabbing her multiple times in the chest and abdomen. When police found her body, the savagery of the attack was immediately apparent. This wasn't a simple murder, but a frenzied act of overkill. Initially, Sutcliffe focused his attacks on the red light districts, stalking prostitutes in Leeds and Bradford. These vulnerable women, already marginalized by society, became perfect victims for a predator who understood that their deaths might generate less public outcry. He would cruise the streets in his car, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When he found an isolated target, he would park nearby and approach on foot, his weapons concealed beneath his jacket. The attacks became increasingly vicious as Sutcliffe's confidence grew. He didn't just kill, he mutilated. Bodies were found with dozens of stab wounds, creating crime scenes that looked like slaughterhouses. Blood would pool around the victims, soaking into the ground, as their lives drained away through multiple puncture wounds. The screwdriver, his favorite weapon, would tear through skin and muscle, creating jagged wounds that medical examiners struggled to categorize. But Sutcliffe's bloodlust wasn't limited to sex workers. In 1977, he shattered the police narrative by murdering 16-year-old Jane McDonald, a shop assistant with no connection to prostitution. This innocent teenager became proof that Sutcliffe's appetite for violence had no boundaries. The hammer struck her head with the same devastating force he had used on previous victims, while the screwdriver found its mark in her chest and back, turning a young woman's promising future into a blood-soaked nightmare. The MacDonald murder sparked mass hysteria across Yorkshire. Women began traveling in groups, carrying makeshift weapons, and avoiding the streets after dark. The realization that the Ripper didn't discriminate meant that any woman could be his next target. Mothers kept their daughters indoors, while husbands walked their wives to work. An entire region lived in fear of a man who could strike anywhere, anytime, with deadly efficiency. Sutcliffe's hunting techniques evolved with each kill. He learned to approach from blind spots, to choose locations with multiple escape routes, and to strike with lightning speed. The hammer blow became his calling card, a single devastating impact that would drop a victim instantly, leaving them helpless for the prolonged torture that followed. He took pleasure in the methodical stabbing, each thrust of the screwdriver accompanied by spurts of arterial blood that painted his hands crimson. The psychological impact of his crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Women who survived his attacks were left permanently traumatized, their memories haunted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind and the flash of metal in the darkness. Some victims who survived the initial hammer blow would remain conscious as Sutcliffe began his stabbing ritual, experiencing every puncture wound while unable to defend themselves. What made Sutcliffe even more terrifying was his ability to vanish after each attack. He would strike with savage brutality, then disappear back into normal life, returning home to his wife as if nothing had happened. This Jekyll and Hyde existence meant he could be anyone. The man serving you at the shop, the driver passing on the road, the worker in the next office. The Yorkshire Ripper wasn't a shadowy figure from nightmares. He was hiding in plain sight, his hands still stained with blood from his latest victim, while he maintained the facade of respectability. Case File 06, Dennis Nilsen, The Kindly Killer's Grotesque Collection. What drives a man to murder not for sexual gratification, not for money or revenge, but simply to have someone who will never leave? What kind of loneliness is so profound, so unbearable, that death becomes preferable to abandonment? Welcome to the twisted world of Dennis Nilsen, where corpses became companions and murder was just the price of permanent company. In the quiet streets of North London during the early 1980s, an unassuming civil servant was conducting a macabre experiment in companionship. Dennis Nilsen, known to his neighbors as a polite, helpful man who worked at the local job center, was secretly transforming his modest flats into chambers of death where the living became the dead, and the dead became his most cherished possessions. Nilsen's hunting ground was London's gay pub scene, where vulnerable young men, many homeless, unemployed, or struggling with their sexuality, could be found drowning their sorrows in alcohol. He presented himself as their salvation, a kind stranger offering food, warmth, and a safe place to sleep. What these desperate souls couldn't have imagined was that accepting his invitation meant they would never leave his flat alive. His method was deceptively gentle compared to other killers. There were no hammers or knives, no extended torture sessions or screams of agony. Instead, Nilsen employed a more intimate form of murder, strangulation with a ligature while his victims slept. Picture the scene. A young man, grateful for shelter and companionship, finally relaxing on Nilsen's sofa or bed, perhaps for the first time in weeks. As sleep overtook him, Nilsen would quietly retrieve a necktie or belt and position himself behind his unsuspecting guest. The killing process was almost ritualistic in its tenderness. Nilsen would slip the ligature around his victim's neck with practiced precision, then tighten it slowly, watching as consciousness faded from their eyes. Some victims would wake briefly, their hands clawing at their throats as they realized what was happening, but Nilsen's grip was unyielding. He would maintain pressure until all struggle ceased, until the body beneath him went completely limp. For victims who proved more difficult to subdue, Nilsen had a secondary method: drowning. His bathroom became an execution chamber where he would force victims' heads underwater in the bathtub or even the kitchen sink. The terror in their eyes as they realized their fate would be the last thing they ever experienced. Bubbles escaping their lips as their lungs filled with water and their bodies convulsed in their final moments. But death was merely the beginning of Nilsen's true ritual. Unlike other killers who disposed of bodies quickly, Nielsen treasured his victims. He would carefully lift the corpse, noting how death had transformed his guest from a living, breathing person into a perfect, permanent companion. The body would be tenderly washed in the bathtub, cleaned of any evidence of the struggle that had ended its life. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Nielsen's crimes, his elaborate post-mortem care routine. He would dress the corpses in clean clothes, sometimes his own, creating a grotesque parody of intimacy. The bodies would be positioned on his bed or sofa, propped up as if they were simply sleeping or watching television. Nielsen would talk to them, sharing his day's events, discussing television programs, even reading aloud from books. This wasn't necrophilia in the traditional sexual sense. It was something far more psychologically disturbing. Nielsen had created a collection of permanent companions who would never criticize him, never leave him, never break his heart. He would spend hours arranging and rearranging the bodies, sometimes moving them from room to room like macabre furniture, always ensuring they were positioned to provide him with the illusion of companionship. For days or weeks, Nielsen would maintain this fantasy. He would sleep beside the decomposing corpses, wake up next to them, and wish them good morning as if they were still alive. The smell of decay became familiar, even comforting to him. He would kiss their cold foreheads, hold their stiffening hands, and whisper endearments to ears that would never hear again. Eventually, even Nielsen couldn't ignore the reality of decomposition. When the bodies became too putrid to maintain his fantasy, he would begin the grisly process of disposal. At his Melrose Avenue address, which had a garden, he would dismember the corpses with kitchen knives and a handsaw, methodically separating limbs from torsos and heads from necks. The body parts would be burned on bonfires, the flames consuming what remained of his former companions. At his later flat in Cranley Gardens, disposal became more challenging. Without access to a garden, Nielsen had to devise creative solutions. He would boil the flesh from bones in large cooking pots, filling his kitchen with the stench of rendering human remains. Smaller pieces would be flushed down the toilet or ground up in the kitchen sink disposal unit, while larger bones were carefully dismembered and stored in bags. The ritualistic nature of both the murders and the disposal reveals the depth of Nielsen's psychological disturbance. Each victim represented not just a life taken, but a relationship created and maintained until decomposition made it impossible to continue. He wasn't killing for pleasure or profit. He was killing to solve the problem of loneliness in the most horrific way imaginable. What made Nielsen particularly dangerous was his ability to attract exactly the kind of victims who wouldn't be missed immediately. Homeless young men, those estranged from their families, and individuals struggling with addiction or mental health issues became his preferred targets. These vulnerable souls, desperate for human connection, found in Nielsen someone who seemed to understand their pain, never realizing that his solution to loneliness was permanent and deadly. Dennis Nielsen transformed murder into a grotesque form of collecting, where human beings became objects to be acquired, maintained, and eventually discarded when they no longer served their purpose. His crimes represent the ultimate corruption of human companionship, where the desperate need for connection became a justification for the most intimate form of betrayal, the theft of life itself for the sake of preventing abandonment. Case File 07, Robert Maudsley, Britain's real-life Hannibal. What happens when childhood trauma becomes so severe, so fundamentally damaging, that it transforms a victim into something far more terrifying than his original abusers? What kind of monster is created when systematic rape and torture become the foundation of a young mind's development? Meet Robert Maudsley, a man so dangerous that Britain built him his own personal hell just to contain the beast they helped create. In the concrete depths of Wakefield Prison sits a man who has become Britain's most feared inmate. Robert Maudsley, dubbed Hannibal the Cannibal by a sensationalist press, represents the ultimate failure of the system designed to protect children. His story begins not with his first murder, but with a childhood so horrifically abusive that it reads like a blueprint for creating a killer. Picture a young boy, barely out of infancy, being systematically tortured by the very people who should have protected him. Maudsley's father didn't just beat his children, he orchestrated campaigns of violence that would have broken adult minds. But for Robert, the worst was yet to come. Night after night, his father would drag him into darkened rooms where unspeakable acts of sexual violence would unfold. The repeated rapes didn't just damage his body, they shattered his developing psyche into fragments that would never properly heal. This wasn't a case of occasional abuse or momentary lapses in parental judgment. This was systematic psychological warfare waged against a defenseless child. Maudsley later told psychiatrists that the trauma had embedded itself so deeply in his mind that he could hear voices, not hallucinations, but the echo of his own rage demanding vengeance against his tormentors. "If I had killed my parents in 1970, he once confessed, none of these people would have died. By 1974, that suppressed rage had found its first outlet. Working as a rent boy in London's underground sex trade itself. A tragic consequence of his shattered childhood, Maudsley encountered John Farrell, a predator who made the fatal mistake of showing him photographs of children he had sexually abused. In that moment, something primal and violent awakened in Maudsley's damaged psyche. The images triggered memories of his own violation, and suddenly Farrell wasn't just a client, he was every abuser who had ever harmed an innocent child. The killing was swift and personal. Maudsley produced a length of wire or cord accounts vary and slipped it around Farrell's neck from behind. But this wasn't a quick strangulation. As Farrell struggled and gasped, clawing at the ligature cutting into his throat, Maudsley applied steady, relentless pressure. He watched as the man's face turned purple, as his eyes bulged with terror and recognition of approaching death. The garroting continued long past the point of unconsciousness, past the point where Farrell's struggles ceased, until life had been completely squeezed from his body. What happened next revealed the depth of Maudsley's psychological damage. Instead of fleeing or disposing of the body, he immediately turned himself in to police. This wasn't the action of a calculating killer trying to evade justice. It was the desperate act of a man who recognized the monster growing inside him and begged for help before it consumed him entirely. The system's response was to send him to Broadmoor Hospital, supposedly a place of healing and rehabilitation. Instead, it became the stage for even greater horrors. In 1977, Maudsley and another patient, David Cheeseman, identified their next target, David Francis, a convicted child molester whose very presence triggered the same rage that had consumed Maudsley 3 years earlier. The two men barricaded themselves in a cell with Francis, creating a soundproof chamber where they could work without interruption. What followed was 9 hours of systematic torture that transformed murder into an extended ritual of vengeance. Francis wasn't just killed, he was methodically broken down, piece by piece, moment by agonizing moment. The details of those 9 hours remain classified, too disturbing even for hardened investigators to fully document. But Broadmoor's failure to contain Maudsley's violence led to an even deadlier miscalculation. Transferred to Wakefield Prison in 1978, he found himself surrounded by exactly the kind of predators who had destroyed his childhood. The prison population included numerous sex offenders, and to Maudsley's damaged mind, each one represented his father. Each one deserved the same fate that he wished he could have inflicted on his original abuser. On a single day in 1978, Maudsley's restraint finally shattered completely. His first target was Salney Darwood, serving time for manslaughter and sexual assault. Maudsley lured him to his cell with casual conversation, then struck with lightning efficiency. Using a makeshift weapon crafted from prison materials, likely a sharpened piece of metal or reinforced plastic, he stabbed Darwood repeatedly in the chest and abdomen, each thrust accompanied by spurts of arterial blood that painted the cell walls crimson. But one murder wasn't enough to satisfy the rage that had been building for decades. Still covered in Darwood's blood, Maudsley prowled the prison wing like a hunting predator, searching for his next victim. He found William Roberts, a 5-6-year-old man serving time for attempting to rape a 4-year-old girl, exactly the kind of crime that had been perpetrated against Maudsley himself as a child. The attack on Roberts was even more savage than the first murder. Maudsley didn't just stab him, he battered the older man's head against the concrete walls of the prison corridor, creating a percussion of bone against stone that echoed through the wing. Blood and brain matter splattered across the walls as Roberts's skull cracked and split under the repeated impacts. The violence continued long past the point of death, fueled by decades of suppressed trauma finally finding its outlet. When the killing frenzy finally subsided, Maudsley calmly walked to the prison office, placed his blood-soaked weapon on the duty officer's desk, and delivered a line that has become legendary in British criminal history. "You'll be too short at the next roll call." The casual tone of his confession, delivered while still covered in his victim's blood, demonstrated the complete emotional disconnection that had allowed him to commit such savage acts. The authorities' response was unprecedented in British penal history. Recognizing that Maudsley represented a threat unlike any other prisoner, they constructed a special 2-cell unit in Wakefield's basement, essentially a prison within a prison designed to contain one man. The glass cage, as it became known, features perspex walls that allow constant observation while preventing any human contact. For over 4 decades, Maudsley has lived in near total isolation, spending 23 hours a day in his custom-built cell. He has no contact with other inmates, no participation in prison programs, no hope of release. His meals are passed through slots. His exercise consists of solitary walks in a small courtyard, and his only human interaction comes from heavily monitored conversations with guards and medical staff. What makes Maudsley's case so disturbing isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the clear pattern of victim selection. 3 of his 4 victims were child molesters or sex offenders, men whose crimes mirrored the abuse Maudsley had suffered as a child. His murders represent a twisted form of vigilante justice, where the victim became the executioner and childhood trauma transformed into adult vengeance. Robert Maudsley embodies the ultimate failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. His childhood abuse created a killer, and the system's subsequent failures to contain or treat him resulted in 4 more deaths. He remains Britain's longest-serving prisoner in solitary confinement, a living reminder that some damage can never be undone, and some monsters are created by the very people who should have prevented their existence. Case File 08, Joanna Dennehy. When women become predators. What happens when the nurturing instinct that defines traditional femininity becomes twisted into something predatory and savage? What kind of woman finds sexual excitement in the act of stabbing men to death? Meet Joanna Dennehy, a killer who shattered every stereotype about female violence and proved that the capacity for sadistic murder knows no gender boundaries. In March 2013, the quiet streets of Peterborough became a hunting ground for Britain's most dangerous female serial killer. Joanna Dennehy, a 30-year-old mother who looked like she could be anyone's neighbor, was conducting an experiment in murder that would challenge everything criminologists thought they knew about female violence. Over 10 blood-soaked days, she would kill 3 men and attempt to murder 2 more, all while maintaining the chilling detachment of someone sampling different flavors of ice cream. Dennehy's path to murder began with a simple question that reveals the depths of her psychological disturbance. She wanted to discover if she was as cold as I thought I was. This wasn't a crime of passion, domestic dispute, or financial desperation. This was calculated experimentation with human life, conducted by a woman whose capacity for empathy had been completely severed. Her first victim was Łukasz Slaboszewski, a 31-year-old Polish immigrant who had made the fatal mistake of believing Dennehy was his girlfriend. She lured him to a property with sexually suggestive text messages, playing on his romantic feelings to draw him into her trap. When Slaboszewski arrived, expecting intimacy, he found death instead. Dennehy produced a large kitchen knife and, without hesitation or explanation, drove the blade directly into his heart. The precision of that first kill reveals something chilling about Dennehy's mindset. This wasn't a frenzied attack or a moment of lost control. It was a calculated execution designed to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. The knife pierced Slaboszewski's chest with surgical accuracy, puncturing his heart and causing massive internal hemorrhaging. He would have died within minutes, blood filling his chest cavity as his heart struggled to pump through the severed muscle tissue. But what happened after the murder was even more disturbing than the killing itself. Instead of panic, remorse, or attempts to cover up her crime, Dennehy felt something entirely different: satisfaction. The experiment had worked. She was indeed as cold as she thought, and the discovery excited rather than horrified her. Murder, she realized, was Moorish, a word typically reserved for describing addictive snacks or television shows, now applied to the act of taking human life. Just days later, she struck again. Her housemate, 56-year-old John Chapman, became victim number 2 in what was rapidly becoming a killing spree. This time, Dennehy didn't rely on deception or seduction. She simply approached Chapman in their shared living space and began stabbing him, targeting his neck and chest with repeated thrusts of the knife. The attack was frenzied and brutal. Chapman's body was found with multiple stab wounds, his blood splattered across the walls and floor. After butchering Chapman, Dennehy reportedly told an accomplice, "Oops, I've done it again," a casual reference that treated murder like a minor social faux pas rather than the ultimate violation of human life. The flippant tone reveals the complete absence of normal emotional responses that typically accompany extreme violence. For Dennehy, killing had become routine, even mundane. Her third victim was Kevin Lee, her 48-year-old landlord and lover, whose murder would demonstrate the full extent of Dennehy's sadistic creativity. She didn't just kill Lee, she humiliated him in death, dressing his corpse in a black sequined dress before dumping the body in a roadside ditch. This final degradation wasn't random. It was a deliberate act of sexual sadism designed to rob her victim of dignity even in death. The positioning of Lee's body revealed crucial insights into Dennehy's psychological makeup. This wasn't simply about murder. It was about power, control, and sexual gratification derived from the complete domination of another human being. The sequined dress was her signature, a calling card that announced to the world that she was responsible for reducing a living man to a humiliated corpse. But 3 murders weren't enough to satisfy Dennehy's appetite for violence. Accompanied by her accomplice, Gary Stretch, she drove to Hereford and began hunting for random victims, a behavior pattern almost exclusively associated with male serial killers. In broad daylight, with the confidence of someone shopping for groceries, she began stalking men walking their dogs in public parks. Her first random victim was Robin Bereza, attacked without warning or provocation. Dennehy approached him casually, then suddenly produced her knife and began stabbing. The blade penetrated his chest and abdomen multiple times as Bereza struggled to understand what was happening. Only luck and immediate medical attention prevented this attack from becoming her 4th murder. 9 minutes later, she struck again. John Rogers became her 2nd random victim, subjected to the same sudden, brutal assault that had nearly killed Bereza. The knife wounds were deep and precise, targeting vital organs with the skill of someone who had practiced this form of violence extensively. Rogers's survival was again a matter of chance, rather than any mercy on Dennehy's part. What makes these random attacks particularly terrifying is their complete lack of motive. Bereza and Rogers had never seen Dennehy before, had done nothing to provoke her anger, and posed no threat to her safety. They were simply convenient targets for a woman who had discovered that stabbing men provided her with sexual and psychological gratification that she craved like a drug. The methodology of Dennehy's attacks reveals a killer operating at the intersection of sexual sadism and thrill-seeking behavior. Each stabbing provided her with a rush of adrenaline and arousal that she found irresistible. The knife wasn't just a weapon. It was an instrument of pleasure, each penetration of flesh accompanied by waves of excitement that normal people derive from consensual sexual activity. Her choice of weapon is also significant. Knives require close contact with victims, allowing the killer to feel the resistance of flesh and bone, to hear the victim's final breaths, to watch the light fade from their eyes. This intimate form of murder appealed to Dennehy's sadistic nature, providing maximum psychological and sensory stimulation from each killing. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Dennehy's reaction to the media coverage of her crimes. Rather than hiding or showing remorse, she was reportedly excited by the national manhunt and the attention her murders had generated. The fear she had created, the resources devoted to capturing her, the headlines screaming about Britain's most dangerous woman, all of it fed her narcissistic need for recognition and power. Joanna Dennehy demolished every comfortable assumption about female violence, proving that women are just as capable of sadistic, predatory murder as their male counterparts. Her crimes serve as a terrifying reminder that evil recognizes no gender boundaries, and that the capacity for savage brutality can lurk behind even the most seemingly ordinary facade. Here's the first two, written in your requested horror crime thriller documentary tone with 800 words each, following your structure and style.